Had a very beautiful community. It's a pleasure to be with you, and we're going to look at an important and resonant article from the FT called Ukraine Faces Its Darkest Hour. It's so much not the darkest hour for me to be with you, because today I had a period of perhaps an hour and a half of a neurologically mediated paralysis, which is atypical for me. I only have sometimes issues controlling swallowing and breathing in a brainstem mediated way. But since I caught the virus 2 months ago, and it interacted so badly with my myalgic encephalomyelitis, I've begun to drift on several dimensions. And today I had the energy to stand up and the energy to speak, enough energy at least, but I couldn't send the signal to do so. It's like being imprisoned within your body. So it's fantastic to be able to speak with you now. This is an article that's confronting and challenging. I'm going to comment on whether it's balanced or not, both analytically and journalistically at the end. But first of all, let me make this analytical remark. For goodness sake, let's stop producing analyses of the sustainability of the war for the one party that aren't connected to to the question of its sustainability for the other party, right? It's meaningless to say, oh, look, the enemy is falling, without an analysis of whether you or your side that you support are falling faster or slower than the enemy. So you can't separate these two, and that's very important, right? So all of these videos that say Putin's war is unsustainable often give you the impression that Ukraine is winning or that the West is winning. It doesn't indicate any such impression, except in analytical connection with an equivalent analysis of Ukraine. So there's a piece by Ben Hall, Christopher Miller, Henry Foy, FT. In a command post, and I've skimmed it before, but we're going to read about 30% of it together. In a command post near the embattled East Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk, soldiers from the separate presidential brigade bemoan the dithering in Washington about permission to use Western weapons. They are making us fight with one hand tied behind our back. Right now, the battalion's commander says, I'm thinking more about how to save my people. It's quite hard, he continues, to imagine we'll be able to move the enemy back to the borders of 1991. Once buoyed by hopes of liberating their lands, even soldiers at the front now voice a desire for negotiations with Russia to end the war. One soldier says, I'm for negotiations now. Another, an officer, says, if the US turns off the spigot, we are finished. Ukraine is heading, the piece carries on, into what may be one of the darkest moments of the war so far. It's losing on the battlefield in the east of the country, with Russian forces advancing relentlessly, albeit at immense cost in men and equipment to the Russian side. Ukraine is struggling to restore its depleted ranks with motivated and well-trained soldiers, while an arbitrary military mobilization system is causing real social tension. It is also facing a bleak winter of severe power and potentially heating outages. So in terms of the mobilization challenges, brief remark, any modern society is going to face historically disproportionate mobilization challenges because of the untethered nature of modern societies that we sometimes talk about. So mobilizing people, even if something is existential for your country, is harder for any country in 2024 than it is in 1914. Second, significant problems with a vision of victory in Ukraine, because Ukraine is stuck in between a vision of victorious territorial liberation and another not yet elaborated vision of victory. There's challenge about the various, unfortunately, Soviet elements of the Ukrainian military. There's problems with training, and there's problems with the government's discourse about mobilization. It's often a discourse of compulsion, right? You come and do this, rather than we're in this together, working toward a civic goal, and we are not forcing you into something. We are in a reciprocal relationship here as part of a very big military, political, and cultural project, and we're all in this together. Right? That is not sufficiently present in the discourse of Ukraine's government. And often you can assume, because most of the community doesn't know much about Ukraine, that Zelensky is a magisterial communicator with his own people. That doesn't necessarily follow. In some ways he is, in some ways he isn't. Zelensky is coming under pressure from Western partners to find a path toward a negotiated settlement, even if there is skepticism about Russia's willingness to enter talks anytime soon. So this is accurate, and it's a very peculiar situation, because just as in Ukraine, one picture of victory seems inaccessible without it being substituted by another. So in the West, there's a trajectory, there's a tendency in Western centers of power to want to bring the war to a close, but except for irresponsible political actors who want to sell Ukraine out to this aggressive Russo-Chinese quasi-alliance that's trying to dominate Europe, except for the irresponsible actors, the responsible actors don't see a way how to end the war. They want to end it, but they don't see a way how to do that. They don't have any kind of a small s strategy here as things stand. So there's momentum toward this goal, but there is no clear picture of what that goal means in practice. Senior Ukrainian official is quoted as saying most players want de-escalation here. Jeremy Shapiro, head of the Washington office of the European Council on Foreign Relations, says the Biden administration is aware that its present strategy is not sustainable because, quote, we are losing the war. He means we, the West, are losing the war. Most threatening of all for Ukraine is the possibility of a Trump victory in November. Now, let's say a couple of things about that now. But I think, health allowing, again, that deserves a main channel video. So imagine Trump wins and wants to do a very beautiful deal. Well, what could Ukraine bring to the table? Ukraine could say, we want NATO membership. In exchange, we will agree to not be pursuing by military means the reacquisition of our territories, but we won't acknowledge their legitimacy, right? Ukraine can never acknowledge the legitimacy of the Russian annexation of their territory, because no government could be sustainable, stable in Ukraine if it did that. So Ukraine can only say, yes, they are our territories, the Russians just happen to have them, and we can promise that we won't try to regain them by military means. Well, that's not acceptable to Putin. What Putin wants is weakening of the sanctions, fake security guarantees for Ukraine, which means no NATO, no solid Western security guarantees, and then some kind of a weak set of security guarantees, potentially to which Russia is itself a party. And then he wants demilitarization in Ukraine. So that would be, not just for Ukraine, but for us, a kind of subordination to this Russo-Chinese quasi-alliance in Europe. So we can't responsibly do that. But Putin can't, without feeling like he is being subordinated, agree to what Ukraine can plausibly stretch to, while being responsible about its own political and economic viability. So Trump's, as things stand in the first instance, likely to hit a big fat no way answer from Mr. Putin. If Trump wants to offer something that is remotely sustainable, and if he wants to offer Putin everything that Putin wants, it's not just unacceptable to Ukraine, it is even insufficient for Ukraine to even have a negotiating position. Senior Ukrainian official says Zelensky's visit was neither a triumph nor a catastrophe, but Zelensky came away without further steps toward NATO being made and without disinhibition over the use of Western weapons. US officials, the article says, were unimpressed by Zelensky's quote-unquote victory plan, which includes massive amounts of Western weaponry being requested. An advisor who helped prepare the document says Zelensky had no choice but to restate his insistence on NATO membership because anything else would have been perceived as a retreat on the question of Western security guarantees. So yes, without either NATO or some other sort of meaningful Western security guarantees, Ukraine doesn't have a viable negotiating position, no matter how much military support it gets from the West. That's my assessment. Although Zelensky's victory plan restated old objectives, its significance is that it shifts Ukraine's war aims from total territorial liberation to simply bending the war in Ukraine's favor and then negotiating. Multiple European diplomats registered the difference in tone, and they noted more openness from Ukrainian officials for potentially agreeing to a ceasefire even when Russian troops are on their territory. Then there is a set of remarks about the Ukrainian public and a few stats offered, gently pointing in the direction of folks being more open to negotiations, but not being terribly open to territorial compromise. Talks about how life is going to get harder, talks about the fate of the energy system through the winter, talks about the mobilization tensions and problems, talks about the rise of a nationalist minority that may be opposed to compromise, whether it's in Ukraine's interest or not. And then one Western official is quoted as saying, land for NATO membership is just the only game in town and everybody knows it. Nobody will say it out loud, but it's the only strategy on the table. But then a few remarks are made about how distant in practice NATO membership seems for Ukraine. Very few of the alliance's members feel it's possible without a full, lasting ceasefire and a defined line on the map that determines what portion of Ukraine's territory the alliance's mutual defense clause applies to. Just think about this for Putin, unless he's in a desperate position, how completely unacceptable it is for Putin to have not just a NATO member on his border, well, he already has some, but of a NATO on his border that's Ukraine, and that feels extravagant, justified animosity toward Russia. Ukrainian official says, I don't think Russia would agree to our participation in NATO. And that's roughly the piece. So let's discuss this. Now, journalistically, the piece is okay. So let me explain why. There's a very important principle in reporting, and that's that there is a distinction between balance in output and balance in a single article. So let's take an example. There's a Conservative Party leadership race in the UK. And imagine that Radio 4 invites one candidate on a Tuesday. Well, if you tune in on a Tuesday, that feels terribly biased. But it's not, because on the next Tuesday, they're going to invite the next candidate and then the other couple of candidates. So that is a lack of balance in a single program or in a single article that is then justified by a balancing out across the entire output. So what would make the article problematic isn't the absence from it of consideration of Russia's sustainability of the war, but an absence of work by the Financial Times on the sustainability of the war in Russia. So it's that would make the article disbalanced, not right, the absence of such considerations in the very same piece. So that's balance in output versus balance in within a single piece, a single film, a single article. Having said all of this, the discussion that this article mirrors quite accurately as happening in Western centers of power is a bit delusional and does lack context. So what are the things that it lacks contextually? Well, it lacks the following two things. Number one, that Putin's war aims are unchanged. It's still full political control over Ukraine. And second, it mirrors discourse in Western centers of power that lacks the understanding that, as I put it on Twitter today, if I were Putin's amoral advisor, I wouldn't in a million years recommend him to stop the war now. It's not in his interest as far as every bit of public information that we have goes. So what's the issue here? The issue is that there's a lot of talk about pushing Ukraine, nudging Ukraine toward a peace deal that may be unavailable because the Kremlin doesn't want it and the Kremlin isn't interested in it, and it isn't in the Kremlin's interests. So the idea that Ukraine needs to be open to negotiations, right, runs the risk of missing this critical piece of analysis of whether Putin wants or should want, if he were rational, to stop the war now. And the answer on both of these elements is a no. Moreover, Putin can continue the war while largely protecting the population from it for a while longer. We don't know how long. Let's say for a year and a half. So it's incredibly important and palpably absent, these conversations, incredibly important to keep in them, the idea that Mr. Putin wants and needs the war. And that's what I would say is a piece of context that's missing here. But where it's missing isn't actually from the article, it's missing from some of the discourse that the article accurately and faithfully mirrors. Lots of love. Thank you so much for being with me.